There is one game we all play, and that game is called real life. Not everyone is good at it, but some of us are. Real life is an open world game with endless possibilities. And after all, only the uncultured spend their day-to-day life in just one country. So join me in my life of leisure as I explore the best games for the handheld around the world. Today I am finally leaving Canada, but before I go and leave, I thought I would check out Niagara Falls. This location holds a lot of sentimental value to me personally, as in 1812 this was the location that the good old British Empire gave those American traitors a well-deserved bloody good thrashing. From watching American television, they seem to love talking about July 4th and how they beat the Empire, but in the most recent war between the two powers, it was time for the Empire to strike back. They got their revenge and absolutely battered the rebel scum, eventually leading to the existence of the beautiful country of Canada, who, out of respect for their heritage, even have the Queen on some of their banknotes. Yeah. Anyway, history lessons aside, Niagara Falls is absolutely delightful. The setting is almost fantasy-like, which led me to the idea of covering something fantasy-based today. So, speaking of fantasies, I decided that of course there is no fantasy adventure bigger than Final Fantasy. Final Bloody Fantasy, a game with arguably the most ironic name in all of gaming, was a game which was originally released 29 years ago, way back in 1987. Soon we will see the 15th entry in the series, which will be released later this month, and that isn't even including the vast amounts of spin-offs and remakes the series has also received. So today I decided we would start right at the very beginning, where the series originally began. Well, kind of anyway. You see, over in my native home of Europe, the first entry in the Final Fantasy series was actually Final Fantasy VII. For a while, the 12-year-old me made the assumption that it was the first game in the series as well. After all, there wasn't many game series in the 90s that would have already had 7 entries. It just sounded like a cool hip 90s name, like Mega Man X for example. Anyway, the truth would soon be revealed, as after the mass success of Final Fantasy 7, 8 and 9 on the Sony PlayStation, Final Fantasy Fever had swept the nation, so we would soon receive ports of the unreleased earlier games in the series on the Sony PlayStation and Game Boy Advance. As a man who loves his handhelds around the world, I played through and completed Final Fantasy VI on my trip to Tunisia, Final Fantasy V on my trip to Cuba, and Final Fantasy IV on my trip to Florida. It is kind of a tradition for me to play through and complete old Final Fantasy games in different fantastical settings around the world. So I thought whilst I was in Canada, I would play through Final Fantasy I for the first time. The original Final Fantasy game saw its first release in Europe as part of a compilation with Final Fantasy II. These versions of the game featured enhanced music and graphics and received complete overhauls, similar to that of Mario All-Stars. On the PlayStation, this pairing was known as Final Fantasy Origins, and on the GBA it was known as Dawn of Souls. I have just played through the first Final Fantasy game which was part of this pack, so that is the game I'm going to be talking about with you today. Anyway, for those who have lived under a rock for the last 30 years, Final Fantasy is a turn-based Japanese role-playing game. The story follows 4 youths called the Light Warriors, who each carry one of their world's 4 elemental orbs, which have been darkened by the 4 elemental fiends. Together, they quest to defeat these evil forces, restore light to the orbs, and save their world. The story itself isn't too deep, it is generally storyline-wise what you would refer to as a generic JRPG these days. I will not go into the story side of things any further however, as I wouldn't want to ruin it for anyone looking to experience this game for themselves. Allegedly, this game was originally going to be called Fighting Fantasy, but the name was changed to Final Fantasy when the development team discovered Fighting Fantasy was the title of a series of single-player role-playing game books. The game was named Final Fantasy because Square apparently believed the game would be the last title they ever released as the company faced bankruptcy. Instead, The game was a great commercial success, and we have been receiving entry after bloody entry in this series ever since, even to this day. Anyway, you start the game by choosing a team of 4 characters to form a party. Once your decisions are made, you are then locked into that choice for the duration of the game. Each character has an occupation or character class with different attributes and abilities that are either innate or can be acquired. There are 6 classes: Fighter, Thief, Black Belt, Red Mage, White Mage and Black Mage. Personally, I chose to stick with the default 4 characters offered: the Fighter, the Thief, the Black and White Mage. That team of individuals looked fairly balanced to me. After all, I didn't feel like rocking the boat too much. Once you have your team in place, the game's plot develops as you progress through the game as you traverse on an overworld map and go through various towns and dungeons. The towns are chock full of residents, some of which will offer you helpful information to aid you in your quest as you go along. Others in the town own shops that sell items, equipment and magic, all of which you can use to help you progress through the game. Dungeons are also a big girthy part of the game. And when I say dungeons, I am not talking about those kinky BDSM dungeons in which people like Wayne Rooney hang out in. I am talking dungeons full of legit monsters that just resemble Wayne Rooney, all of which are out to savage you. These dungeons appear in all sorts of areas, from forests to caves to mountains to swamps to underwater caverns and buildings. These places often hold treasure chests containing rare items that are not available in most stores, and often feature end bosses in which you must defeat in order to progress the game. The game also has a menu screen in which allows the player to keep track of their experience points, levels, equipment, items, magic, etc. If you have played any of the more modern late 90s Final Fantasy games, the system hasn't evolved much along the line. The combat in the game is extremely simple. Again, if you have played the late 90s stuff, you will know exactly what to expect. The first game in the series features the classic Final Fantasy menu-based battle system, in which the player selects an action from a list of options such as attack, magic and item. All these battles are turn-based and continue until either side flees or is defeated. If the player's party wins, each character will gain experience and gil. If it flees, it will be returned to the map screen, and if every character in the party dies, the game will be over and all unsaved progress will be lost. Allegedly, Final Fantasy was the first game to show the player's character on the right side of the screen and the enemies on the left side of the screen, as opposed to the first person view like in the Dragon Quest games. Now I have explained to you about how the basics of the gameplay and story work, let me tell you from my personal experience about some of the good, the bad and the ugly about the first Final Fantasy game. Yeah. Final Fantasy took me 14 hours in total to beat. However, I am not quite sure how much of that time I allocated to taking part in actual meaningful gameplay. I tried to play this game referring to walkthroughs as little as possible. After all, whilst playing this game, anytime I referred to a walkthrough, I was cheating in a way, so I often found myself lost, wandering through pieces of wilderness after pieces of wilderness. After about 7 hours of gameplay and getting lost constantly, I finally worked out that if I hold the B button and select button down at exactly the same time, that I would bring up a world map screen. Better late than ever, eh? But why on earth did the developers decide to map the controls so cryptically? That just blows my mind. For ages I just assumed there wasn't a bloody map. So if you are trying to play this game yourself, remember the bloody B button and the select button brings up the map. So, apart from being lost all the bloody time, another thing that wasted my time was the insane amount of random encounters. Apart from it being a bit soul destroying, doing exactly the same thing over and over and over and over again, it also becomes extremely disorientating as you soon forget which direction you were meant to be heading in the first bloody place. If you have some kind of mental condition, like someone who suffers from OCD for example, you may enjoy ploughing into incessant random battles and obliterating countless bloody goblins and other assorted creatures in rapid succession. But if you are of sane mind like myself, you will realise that this is a complete waste of time and just a cheeky way for the developers to stretch out the game's length. Apart from the random encounters being disorientating, The other problem with them is that there are so bloody many of them that by the time you find your way to fight a meaningful boss, you will find that you are so over-leveled that you will obliterate them with absolute ease. Throughout the game's entire playthrough, I didn't even die once. I even ploughed through and completely decimated the final boss with no hassle. The positive I can draw from getting constantly lost and disorientated is, I guess, well, at least it made the game feel a little bit more like an adventure, which is after all what a JRPG is supposed to be in the first place. Managing to get on track and make discoveries did give me a genuine feeling of fulfillment. I suppose one of the reasons you do not often get lost in modern JRPGs is that they are all so bloody linear. You just play them on a locked track, where in the original Final Fantasy, on the other hand, it is very easy to get lost on the world map or within a dungeon. So to summarise the game, it was good fun. But personally, I would only recommend this game to hardcore fans of the Final Fantasy series, as you will waste hours upon hours in random encounters achieving absolutely nothing. This game was probably very good for its time, but sadly in the modern world there are certainly better choices out there when picking up a JRPG. Either way, whether you love or hate this game, its historical significance and impact cannot be argued. Cheerio! Click that little circular icon of me to subscribe as one of my loyal disciples. I will continue to give you brand new content without fail every single week. If you fancy seeing more of my work right now, after you've clicked the subscribe button of course, then click one of my annotations to watch one of my previous videos. Ta-ta and farewell.